The bustling bank lobby hummed with activity as Kevin stood behind his counter, a forced smile plastered on his face. He mechanically processed transactions, his eyes darting between the clock and the ever-growing line of customers. The monotony of his day was suddenly disrupted when Jamal wheeled himself through the bank's automatic doors. And if you love your family and want to hear more incredible stories like this one, subscribe to our channel. Jamal's presence immediately drew attention. His crisp suit and confident demeanor contrasted sharply with the awkward glances cast his way. As he approached Kevin's counter, the tension in the air became palpable. Kevin's smile faltered, his discomfort evident in the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Good morning," Jamal said, his voice clear and professional. "I need to discuss some issues with my account." Kevin's response was curt, his eyes never quite meeting Jamal's. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't help you with that. You'll need to speak with a manager." Jamal's brow furrowed. "All right. Could you please call a manager for me then?" Kevin hesitated, his fingers hovering over the phone. "I'm afraid they're all in a meeting right now. Perhaps you could come back another time." The exchange didn't go unnoticed by the other customers. Whispers began to circulate, and curious glances were thrown in their direction. Jamal, maintaining his composure, pressed on. "I've taken time off work to come here today. Surely there must be someone available to assist me." Kevin's discomfort grew more apparent. He fidgeted with his tie, avoiding Jamal's gaze. "Sir, I've already explained the situation. There's nothing more I can do for you at the moment." Jamal's patience began to wear thin. He leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "I don't understand. Is there a problem with assisting me?" Kevin's response came out in a rush, his words tumbling over each other. "Look, it's just, well, we have certain policies, you see. The bank doesn't, we're not really equipped to handle special cases." The implications of Kevin's words hung in the air. Jamal's expression hardened as the reality of the situation sank in. "Are you refusing to serve me because I'm in a wheelchair?" Kevin's silence was damning. The murmurs from the other customers grew louder, a mix of shock and disapproval rippling through the lobby. Jamal's voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it now. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor immediately. This is unacceptable." Kevin, now visibly flustered, fumbled for a response. "Sir, as I said, there's no one available right now. Maybe if you could come back another day when we're better prepared." The humiliation Jamal felt was evident in the set of his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. He took a deep breath, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair. "I see. So this is the bank's policy, to discriminate against customers based on their physical abilities?" Kevin's response was barely audible. "It's not. It's just how things are done here." The tension in the lobby had reached a breaking point. Other customers shifted uncomfortably, some openly glaring at Kevin, others averting their eyes from the scene unfolding before them. Jamal, his dignity intact despite the blatant discrimination, began to wheel himself away from the counter. "I will be filing a formal complaint about this incident. Your behavior today is not only unprofessional, but illegal." As Jamal made his way towards the exit, the whispers among the customers grew louder. Some expressed outrage, others disbelief. A few even approached Jamal, offering words of support and asking for details about what had transpired. Kevin stood rooted to the spot, the weight of his actions beginning to sink in. He watched as Jamal left the bank, the doors closing behind him with a finality that seemed to echo through the lobby. The ordinary day at the bank had transformed into something far more significant, setting in motion a chain of events that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. The next day, the bank's usual morning routine was shattered by the arrival of FBI agents, led by Sarah Mitchell, a seasoned investigator with piercing eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. The team swept into the building with purpose. Their presence immediately set the staff on edge, whispers and nervous glances spreading like wildfire. Sarah approached the reception desk, her badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. "I'm Agent Mitchell, FBI. We're here to investigate a complaint of racial discrimination." Her voice was calm, but carried an undercurrent of authority that demanded attention. The bank manager, a portly man named Richard, hurried over, his face a mask of forced pleasantry. "Agent Mitchell, this is quite unexpected. Perhaps we could discuss this in my office." Sarah shook her head. "We'll need to speak with your employees and customers, Mr. Dawson." "Richard Dawson," he replied, sweat beading on his forehead. "But surely there's been some misunderstanding. Our bank has a strict non-discrimination policy." Sarah's gaze was unwavering. "We'll see about that, Mr. Dawson. Now, if you could direct us to your staff areas." As Sarah and her team spread out, Kevin watched from his station, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to focus on his work. When an agent approached him, he felt his heart rate spike. "Sir, we'd like to ask you a few questions about an incident that occurred yesterday," the agent said. Kevin's response was defensive, his words coming out in a rushed jumble. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was just following bank policy. There's nothing wrong with that, is there?" Sarah, overhearing the exchange, made her way over. "And what exactly is this policy you're referring to, Mr. Kevin?" "Just Kevin," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. Sarah pressed on. "Well, Kevin, we've received multiple complaints about discriminatory practices at this bank. Care to shed some light on that?" As Kevin stumbled through his responses, Sarah's attention was drawn to a young man watching the proceedings with keen interest. She approached him, noting his name tag. "Tom, is it? Mind if we have a chat?" Tom nodded, leading Sarah to a quieter corner. His voice was low, tinged with nervousness. "Agent Mitchell, I've seen things here. Practices that aren't right, but I was afraid to speak up." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "That's why we're here, Tom. To uncover the truth and ensure justice is served. Can you tell me more about what you've witnessed?" As Tom began to share his experiences, detailing instances of racial profiling and discriminatory lending practices, Sarah's team continued their investigation. They interviewed customers, pored over documents, and collected statements from staff members. Richard Dawson, meanwhile, was growing increasingly agitated. He cornered Sarah as she was reviewing some files. "Agent Mitchell, I must insist that you cease this disruption of our business. We have powerful friends, you know. This investigation could have serious consequences for your career." Sarah met his gaze coolly. "Are you threatening a federal agent, Mr. Dawson? Because that would be a very unwise move." Richard backpedaled quickly. No, of course not. I'm simply concerned about the reputation of our institution. Surely we can resolve this matter quietly." "This isn't going away, Mr. Dawson," Sarah replied firmly. "We have multiple complaints, and now we're uncovering evidence of systemic issues. This investigation will continue, regardless of any powerful friends you might have." As the day wore on, the tension in the bank continued to escalate. Employees whispered among themselves, some defending the bank's practices, others expressing relief that the truth might finally come to light. Customers watched the proceedings with a mix of curiosity and concern, some even approaching the agents to share their own experiences. Tom, emboldened by his conversation with Sarah, began to feel a sense of purpose. He'd always felt uncomfortable with the bank's practices, but had never had the courage to speak out. Now, he realized, he had a chance to make a difference. As the FBI team prepared to leave for the day, Sarah approached Tom one last time. "Thank you for your honesty," she said quietly. "We'll be in touch. In the meantime, keep your eyes open." Tom nodded, a mixture of fear and determination in his eyes. "I will, and thank you for listening." As Sarah and her team exited the bank, The weight of their presence lingered. Kevin sat at his station, pale and shaken, while Richard Dawson retreated to his office, already on the phone with the bank's lawyers. The once ordinary bank had become the center of a storm, and it was clear that nothing would ever be the same again. In the days following the FBI's visit to the bank, Jamal found himself unable to shake off the anger and humiliation he had experienced. Sitting in his home office, surrounded by law books and case files, he realized that his personal experience was likely just the tip of the iceberg. With renewed determination, he decided to take action. Jamal's fingers flew across his keyboard as he crafted a powerful social media post. "Have you experienced discrimination at Midtown Bank? You're not alone. Join me in fighting for justice." He included details about his own experience and a call to action for others to share their stories. Within hours, the post went viral. Comments and messages flooded in, each one a painful testament to the bank's discriminatory practices. People from all walks of life shared similar experiences of being denied services, given unfavorable loan terms, or treated with disrespect due to their race, disability, or economic status. Overwhelmed by the response but more determined than ever, Jamal organized a meeting at a local community center. As he wheeled himself into the packed room, he was struck by the diversity of the attendees. Young and old, representing various ethnicities and abilities, they all shared a common purpose: to seek justice and change. "Thank you all for coming," Jamal began, his voice strong and clear. "What happened to me at Midtown Bank was not an isolated incident. It's clear that this is a systemic issue that has affected many in our community." As people began to share their stories, the atmosphere in the room grew charged with emotion and solidarity. An elderly woman recounted how she was denied a small business loan despite her excellent credit score. A young man in his 20s described the suspicious looks and extra scrutiny he received every time he visited the bank. Jamal listened intently, taking notes and offering words of support. As the meeting progressed, a sense of unity and purpose began to emerge. People who had felt powerless and alone now found strength in their shared experiences. "We can't let this continue," Jamal declared, his eyes scanning the room. "It's time we made our voices heard. I propose we organize a peaceful demonstration in front of the bank. We'll show them that we won't tolerate discrimination any longer." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic agreement. People began to volunteer for various tasks, making signs, contacting local media, and spreading the word on social media. Jamal felt a surge of hope as he watched the group come together, transforming from victims to activists. As the meeting drew to a close, Jamal addressed the group one final time. "Remember, our strength lies in our unity and our commitment to peaceful action. We're not just fighting for ourselves, but for a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." The day of the demonstration arrived, and Jamal found himself at the forefront of a diverse and determined crowd. As they gathered in front of Midtown Bank, their signs held high and their voices united, the energy was palpable. Local news crews arrived, their cameras capturing the scene as Jamal delivered a powerful speech about equality and justice. "We are here today not just as individuals who have been wronged, but as a community demanding change," Jamal's voice rang out, amplified by a megaphone. "Midtown Bank must be held accountable for its discriminatory practices. We call on them to acknowledge their wrongdoings and take concrete steps towards equality." As Jamal spoke, passers-by stopped to listen, many joining the demonstration on the spot. Social media buzzed with live updates and messages of support from around the city and beyond. The peaceful yet powerful nature of the protest caught the attention of local politicians and civil rights organizations who began to reach out to Jamal for more information. Inside the bank, employees watched the growing crowd with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. Kevin, in particular, felt a knot in his stomach as he recognized Jamal leading the protest. The weight of his actions and their consequences became increasingly difficult to ignore. As the day wore on, the demonstration showed no signs of slowing down. Jamal's impassioned words and the united front of the protesters had sparked a movement larger than any of them had anticipated. What had started as one man's fight against injustice had become a rallying cry for an entire community. As the sun began to set, Jamal addressed the crowd one last time. "This is just the beginning," he declared, his voice hoarse but determined. "We will continue to fight until Midtown Bank and all institutions like it understand that discrimination has no place in our society. Thank you all for standing with me, for standing for justice." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. As people began to disperse, many approached Jamal to shake his hand or share a word of thanks. He felt a profound sense of responsibility and hope. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since that day at the bank, Jamal felt truly empowered. He had become more than just a victim. He was now a symbol of resistance and a voice for change. In the aftermath of the protest, the atmosphere inside Midtown Bank grew increasingly tense. Kevin found himself at the center of a storm he had unwittingly created. As he sat at his desk, he could feel the weight of his colleagues' stares, a mix of curiosity and judgment that made his skin crawl. The television in the break room constantly replayed footage of the demonstration, Jamal's impassioned speech echoing through the halls. Kevin couldn't escape the sound of his voice or the sight of the diverse crowd that had gathered in support. Each time he caught a glimpse, he felt a twinge of something unfamiliar. Was it guilt? Shame? He couldn't quite put his finger on it. During his lunch break, Kevin overheard a group of co-workers discussing the situation. "Can you believe this mess?" one of them said. "All because Kevin couldn't handle a guy in a wheelchair." "It's not just about Kevin," another replied. "You know this has been going on for years. Someone was bound to speak up eventually." Kevin quickly retreated to his desk, his appetite gone. He began to question everything: his actions, his beliefs, the practices he had unquestioningly followed for years. The certainty he once felt about his place in the world and the rightness of his actions began to crumble. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah Mitchell and Tom met in a small, nondescript cafe. They chose a quiet corner, away from prying eyes and ears. Tom nervously fiddled with his coffee cup as Sarah took out a small notebook. "I appreciate you meeting me, Tom," Sarah said, her voice low. "I know this isn't easy for you." Tom nodded, his eyes darting around the cafe. "I can't believe I'm doing this. If anyone at the bank found out..." Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. "What you're doing is brave, Tom. It's also the right thing to do. Now tell me more about what you've witnessed at the bank." For the next hour, Tom poured out everything he had seen and heard over his years at Midtown Bank. He spoke of unwritten policies that discouraged loans to certain neighborhoods, of the subtle ways employees were trained to profile customers, of the pressure to meet quotas that often led to discriminatory practices. As Tom spoke, Sarah took detailed notes, her frown deepening with each revelation. "This goes beyond just one incident," she murmured. "This is systemic corruption." Tom nodded, a mixture of relief and fear on his face. "I've wanted to say something for so long, but I was afraid. Afraid of losing my job, of being ostracized. But seeing Jamal out there, fighting, it made me realize I couldn't stay silent anymore." Sarah reached out and squeezed Tom's hand. "You're doing the right thing, Tom. Your testimony could be crucial in bringing about real change." As they parted ways, Tom felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. Back at the bank, the day was drawing to a close when a memo circulated announcing an emergency staff meeting. Employees gathered in the large conference room, the tension palpable as they waited for management to arrive. Richard Dawson entered, flanked by several stern-looking executives. His usual jovial demeanor was replaced by a grim determination. "I'm sure you're all aware of the situation we're facing," he began. "I want to assure you that Midtown Bank takes these allegations very seriously." A murmur rippled through the room. Kevin sank lower in his chair, feeling all eyes turned towards him. "However," Dawson continued, his voice hardening, "we must stand united in the face of these baseless accusations. Our practices are sound, our policies fair. We will not be bullied by protesters or intimidated by federal investigations." As Dawson spoke, Kevin noticed Tom shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Their eyes met briefly, and Kevin saw something in Tom's expression that made him pause, a mixture of resolve and disappointment that struck a chord deep within him. "If any of you are approached by the media or investigators," Dawson was saying, "you are to direct all inquiries to our legal department. Is that understood?" A chorus of subdued "yes, sirs" filled the room. As the meeting adjourned, Kevin found himself unable to move. He watched as his colleagues filed out, their faces a mix of concern and determination. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that he was standing at a crossroads. The choices he made in the coming days would define not just his career, but his character. As Kevin finally rose to leave, he caught sight of his reflection in the conference room window. The man staring back at him was a stranger, uncertain, conflicted, and for the first time in a long while, deeply questioning the path he had chosen. The bank that had been his world for so long suddenly felt alien and cold. Kevin realized that the coming storm wouldn't just change Midtown Bank. It would change him too, in ways he was only beginning to understand. As the controversy surrounding Midtown Bank continued to grow, Jamal found himself thrust into the spotlight as the face of a burgeoning movement. What had begun as a personal fight for dignity had transformed into a rallying cry for systemic change, and Jamal was determined to seize the moment. In his modest apartment, now serving as an impromptu command center, Jamal worked tirelessly. His dining table was covered with legal documents, newspaper clippings, and a laptop open to various social media platforms. The walls were adorned with charts and timelines, mapping out the history of discrimination at Midtown Bank and beyond. "We need to think bigger," Jamal mused, addressing a small group of volunteers who had gathered to help. "This isn't just about one bank or one incident. It's about challenging the entire system that allows such discrimination to flourish." Among the volunteers was Maria, a young law student who had been inspired by Jamal's story. "What if we started a social media campaign?" she suggested. "We could use hashtags to encourage people from all over the city to share their experiences of discrimination in financial institutions." Jamal's eyes lit up. "That's brilliant, Maria. We'll call it Anjar Bank on Equality. It'll show that this problem goes far beyond Midtown Bank." As the campaign took off, stories began pouring in from across the city and even the country. People shared accounts of being denied loans despite perfect credit scores, of being treated with suspicion or outright hostility when trying to open accounts, and of facing subtle but persistent discrimination in their financial dealings. Jamal's voice grew stronger with each passing day. He gave interviews to local news stations, wrote op-eds for newspapers, and spoke at community gatherings. His message was clear and unwavering. The time for change was now. Meanwhile, inside Midtown Bank, the pressure was mounting. The employees found themselves increasingly divided. Some, like Kevin, were grappling with their role in perpetuating discriminatory practices. Others, fearful for their jobs, clung tightly to the status quo. Tom, emboldened by his meeting with Sarah, began to take subtle actions. He started documenting questionable practices he observed, keeping a detailed log of incidents that seemed to support Jamal's claims. He knew he was walking a dangerous line, but the thought of remaining silent had become unbearable. One morning, as employees filed into the bank, they were met with a sight that made them stop in their tracks. Overnight, activists had plastered the bank's windows with printouts of Bank One equality stories. Each sheet of paper told a personal tale of discrimination, creating a powerful visual representation of the pain caused by the bank's practices. Kevin arrived to find a crowd gathered outside, reading the stories and discussing them in hushed tones. As he pushed through to enter the building, he caught sight of one particular story that made his blood run cold. It was Jamal's account of their interaction, detailed and unflinching in its description of the discrimination he had faced. Inside, Richard Dawson was in a state of barely controlled panic. He barked orders at employees to take down the printouts, but the damage was already done. News crews had arrived, capturing footage of the powerful display. As the day wore on, the bank's phone lines were flooded with calls from concerned customers and angry activists. Social media was ablaze with discussions about Midtown Bank, with many longtime customers publicly declaring their intention to close their accounts. In a desperate attempt to control the narrative, the bank's PR team hastily arranged a press conference. Richard Dawson stood before a sea of reporters, his usual confidence notably absent. Midtown Bank has always been committed to serving all members of our community, he began, his voice wavering slightly. We take these allegations very seriously and are conducting a thorough internal review of our practices. But as questions from the reporters grew increasingly pointed, Dawson's carefully crafted statement began to crumble. When asked about specific incidents of discrimination, including Jamal's, he fumbled for answers, his discomfort palpable. Watching the press conference unfold on a small TV in his apartment, Jamal felt a mix of vindication and determination. They can't ignore us anymore, he said to Maria, who had come to offer support. But this is just the beginning. We need to keep pushing until we see real, lasting change. As night fell, Jamal sat at his computer, drafting plans for the next phase of their campaign. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was ready. The movement he had started had taken on a life of its own, fueled by the voices of countless individuals who had long been silenced. Outside Midtown Bank, a small group of protesters had gathered, holding candles and signs. Among them was Tom, who had decided to join the vigil after his shift. As he stood there, feeling the weight of his secret knowledge and the warmth of solidarity, he knew that the tides were turning. Change was coming to Midtown Bank, whether they were ready for it or not. As the controversy surrounding Midtown Bank reached a fever pitch, FBI agent Sarah Mitchell knew it was time to escalate her investigation. In her sparse office, illuminated by the glow of multiple computer screens, Sarah meticulously pieced together the evidence she had gathered. "We need to go deeper," she muttered to her partner, Agent Rodriguez. "The discrimination at Midtown Bank isn't just a series of isolated incidents. It's a pattern, and I bet it goes all the way to the top." Rodriguez nodded, his expression grim. "What's our next move?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, a determined glint in her eye. "We set up a sting operation. We'll send in undercover agents posing as customers from various backgrounds. Let's see how the bank treats them when they think no one's watching." Over the next few weeks, Sarah's team executed their plan with precision. Agents of different races, abilities, and economic backgrounds visited Midtown Bank, carefully documenting their experiences. The results were damning. The disparities in treatment were clear and consistent, providing irrefutable evidence of systemic discrimination. As Sarah compiled the data, she couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction. "We've got them," she told Rodriguez. "Now we just need to make sure this evidence sees the light of day." Meanwhile, the pressure on Midtown Bank had become nearly unbearable. The constant media scrutiny, coupled with a steadily declining customer base, had created an atmosphere of panic within the institution. Richard Dawson paced his office, his once impeccable suit now rumpled, his tie askew. The phone on his desk rang incessantly, calls from the board of directors, from lawyers, from panicked shareholders. Each time he picked up, the news seemed to get worse. "We need to do something drastic," he barked at his team of advisors. This circus needs to end, now." One of the advisors, a young woman named Jennifer, spoke up hesitantly. "Sir, maybe it's time we considered making some real changes. The evidence against us is mounting, and public opinion—" "Changes?" Dawson interrupted, his face flushing with anger. "The only change we need is in our PR strategy. We are not admitting fault here. Is that clear?" As the meeting adjourned, Jennifer lingered behind. She watched Dawson slump into his chair, his head in his hands, and felt a pang of something between pity and disgust. Making a decision, she slipped out of the office and headed for the elevator. Outside the bank, Kevin found himself face to face with Jamal for the first time since their fateful interaction. Jamal sat in his wheelchair at the head of a small protest, his presence commanding despite his seated position. Kevin approached cautiously, his heart pounding. "Mr. Jamal," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to apologize. What I did, it was wrong. I see that now." Jamal looked up at Kevin, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither man spoke, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Jamal broke the silence. "An apology is a start, Kevin, but it's not enough. What are you going to do to make things right?" Kevin opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He realized with a sinking feeling that he had no answer. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of Tom joining the protest, a sign in his hands and determination in his eyes. Inside the bank, tensions continued to rise. Employees whispered among themselves, wondering who might be next to lose their job as the bank scrambled to contain the damage. The once bustling lobby was eerily quiet, with only a handful of customers trickling in throughout the day. As evening fell, Sarah received an unexpected call. It was Jennifer, Richard Dawson's advisor. "I can't be part of this anymore," Jennifer said, her voice shaking. "I have documents, evidence of the bank's discriminatory policies going back years. Can we meet?" Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. This could be the breakthrough they needed. "Absolutely," she replied. "But we need to be careful. Your safety is paramount." As Sarah hung up the phone, she knew she was on the cusp of blowing the case wide open. The evidence from the sting operation, combined with insider documents, could be enough to bring Midtown Bank to its knees. Outside, the protests showed no sign of slowing down. If anything, they had grown larger and more vocal. Jamal's movement had evolved into a powerful force, drawing support from civil rights organizations, politicians, and celebrities. As night descended on the city, the lights of Midtown Bank glowed ominously against the darkening sky. Inside its walls, secrets festered and tensions simmered. Outside, a movement for change gathered strength. And in the shadows, Sarah Mitchell prepared to strike the blow that would shake the institution to its very foundations. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change lives and redefine the meaning of justice in the world of finance. As the city slept, the players in this drama steeled themselves for the battles to come, each knowing that the next day could bring either triumph or ruin. The day of the trial arrived, casting a shadow of anticipation over the city. The courthouse steps were crowded with protesters, supporters, and media crews, all eager to witness the culmination of the Midtown Bank scandal. Jamal wheeled himself up the ramp, his posture straight and determined. He was flanked by his legal team and a group of fellow plaintiffs, individuals who had come forward with their own stories of discrimination at the hands of Midtown Bank. As they approached the entrance, the crowd erupted in cheers and chants of support. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Jamal's eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of the bank executives, including Richard Dawson, who sat with a team of high-powered lawyers. Their eyes met briefly, and Jamal saw a flicker of uncertainty in Dawson's gaze. As the proceedings began, Jamal's lead attorney, a seasoned civil rights lawyer named Marcus Thompson, delivered a powerful opening statement. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his voice resonating through the packed courtroom. "Today, we are not just trying a single incident of discrimination. We are putting on trial a system that has, for far too long, denied equal access and opportunity to countless individuals based on their race, disability, or economic status." The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, internal memos, statistical analyses, and testimony from former employees. But the most powerful moments came from the plaintiffs themselves. One by one, they took the stand, sharing their experiences of humiliation, frustration, and financial hardship caused by Midtown Bank's discriminatory practices. When it was Jamal's turn to testify, a hush fell over the courtroom. He spoke clearly and passionately, recounting not only his personal experience with Kevin, but also the broader implications of the bank's actions. "This isn't just about me," Jamal said, his voice steady. "It's about every person who has been made to feel less than human because of who they are or what they look like. It's about the dreams deferred, the opportunities denied, and the dignity stripped away. We are here to say, no more." As Jamal's testimony concluded, he noticed Kevin sitting in the back of the courtroom, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Their eyes met for a moment, and Jamal saw something he hadn't expected, a glimmer of understanding, perhaps even remorse. The defense team, led by a sharp-tongued lawyer named Victoria Reeves, fought back hard. They attempted to portray the plaintiffs as opportunists, the evidence as circumstantial, and the bank's policies as misunderstood but fundamentally sound. Midtown Bank has served this community for generations, Reeves argued. These isolated incidents, while regrettable, do not reflect the bank's overall commitment to fairness and equality. But as the trial progressed, cracks began to appear in the bank's facade. Former employees, including Tom, came forward with damning testimony about the unofficial policies and practices that had fostered discrimination. The turning point came when Sarah Mitchell took the stand. With meticulous detail, she laid out the findings of her investigation, including the results of the sting operation and the internal documents provided by Jennifer. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice firm, "the evidence clearly shows a pattern of systemic discrimination that goes beyond individual actions. This was a calculated strategy, implemented at the highest levels of Midtown Bank's management." As Sarah's testimony concluded, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. The weight of the evidence seemed overwhelming, and even some of the bank's staunchest defenders appeared shaken. In a surprising turn of events, Kevin requested to take the stand. His testimony was halting at first, but gained strength as he spoke. "I was wrong," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I followed policies that I knew in my heart were unjust. I was part of a system that hurt people, and I'm here to take responsibility for my actions." As the trial neared its end, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. Closing arguments were delivered with passion and conviction from both sides. Marcus Thompson's final words resonated through the room. "Today, you have the power to send a message that says discrimination has no place in our financial institutions or in our society. A message that says justice and equality are not just lofty ideals, but fundamental rights that must be protected." As the jury retired to deliberate, Jamal sat surrounded by his supporters, feeling a mix of exhaustion and hope. He knew that regardless of the outcome, they had already achieved something significant. They had forced the issue of systemic discrimination into the open, sparking a national conversation that couldn't be ignored. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled. People from all walks of life stood together, united in their demand for justice. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. There was a sense that a new chapter in the fight for equality was about to begin. The jury's deliberations stretched on for days, each passing hour ratcheting up the tension both inside and outside the courthouse. The city seemed to hold its breath, awaiting a verdict that would have far-reaching implications for the financial industry and civil rights movement alike. On the morning of the fourth day, word spread rapidly that the jury had reached a decision. The courthouse quickly filled to capacity, with overflow crowds gathering outside, their eyes fixed on the large screens that had been set up to broadcast the proceedings. As Jamal wheeled himself into the courtroom, he felt the weight of countless hopes and expectations on his shoulders. He glanced at his legal team, their faces a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy. Across the aisle, the Midtown Bank executives sat stone-faced, Richard Dawson's once confident demeanor now markedly subdued. The judge entered, and a hush fell over the room. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked, her voice cutting through the silence. The jury foreman stood, a sealed envelope in hand. "We have, Your Honor." As the clerk read out the verdict, the courtroom erupted in a cacophony of gasps, cheers, and muffled sobs. The jury had found in favor of Jamal and the other plaintiffs on all counts. Midtown Bank was found guilty of systemic discrimination and ordered to pay substantial damages to the affected individuals and communities. But the verdict went beyond mere monetary compensation. The judge, in a groundbreaking decision, ordered Midtown Bank to undergo a complete overhaul of its policies and practices, with ongoing oversight from an independent committee. Furthermore, she recommended a broader investigation into discriminatory practices across the entire banking industry. As the implications of the verdict sank in, Jamal found himself at the center of a whirlwind of emotions and activity. Supporters rushed to congratulate him, reporters clamored for statements, and his phone buzzed incessantly with messages of support and media requests. Outside, the crowd's reaction was electric. Cheers echoed off the courthouse walls as people embraced, cried, and celebrated a victory that many had thought impossible. The scene was one of jubilation, tinged with a sense of long-awaited justice. Amidst the chaos, Jamal caught sight of Kevin standing at the edge of the crowd, a look of both relief and uncertainty on his face. Their eyes met, and Jamal gave a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a recognition of the complex human elements at play in this struggle. As the day wore on, the implications of the verdict began to ripple outward. Other banks and financial institutions scrambled to review their own policies, fearing similar lawsuits. Civil rights organizations hailed the decision as a landmark moment in the fight against institutional racism and discrimination. Sarah Mitchell, watching the scene unfold from the courthouse steps, felt a mix of professional satisfaction and personal triumph. She knew that this case would be a defining moment in her career, but more importantly, it represented a significant step toward the justice she had always fought for. Tom, who had risked so much to come forward, found himself surrounded by well-wishers and fellow whistleblowers. His act of courage had played a crucial role in exposing the truth, and he felt a sense of vindication that overshadowed his fears about the future. As evening fell, Jamal finally had a moment to himself. Sitting in his wheelchair on the courthouse steps, he looked out over the dispersing crowd, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. What had begun as a personal fight for dignity had transformed into a movement that promised to reshape the landscape of financial equality. He thought about the countless individuals who had shared their stories, the brave employees who had risked everything to speak out, and the dedicated legal team that had worked tirelessly to bring this case to fruition. Their collective efforts had not only secured a victory against Midtown Bank, but it also paved the way for broader, systemic change. As Jamal prepared to address the waiting media, he took a deep breath, knowing that his words would carry weight far beyond this moment. The verdict was not an end, but a beginning, a call to action for continued vigilance and advocacy in the fight for equality. With determination in his eyes and strength in his voice, Jamal began to speak, his words carrying the promise of a more just and equitable future. The battle against Midtown Bank had been won, but the larger war against discrimination in all its forms was far from over, and Jamal, along with countless others inspired by this victory, was ready to continue the fight. In the days following the verdict, the ripple effects of the Midtown Bank case spread far and wide. The story dominated headlines, sparked heated debates on talk shows, and became a rallying point for civil rights activists across the nation. Jamal found himself thrust into the national spotlight, his face appearing on magazine covers, and his story being shared as an inspiration to millions. While the attention was overwhelming at times, he remained focused on the larger goal, using this momentum to drive real, lasting change in the financial industry and beyond. Meanwhile, the aftermath of the trial hit Midtown Bank hard. Its stock price plummeted, and customers withdrew their accounts in droves. The once proud institution now stood as a cautionary tale of the consequences of systemic discrimination. Richard Dawson, the face of Midtown Bank throughout the scandal, resigned in disgrace. As he left the bank for the last time, flanked by security and hounded by reporters, the weight of his actions seemed to hang heavily on his shoulders. Kevin, whose testimony had played a crucial role in the trial, found himself at a crossroads. Stripped of his position at the bank and grappling with the consequences of his past actions, he decided to reach out to Jamal. Their meeting, arranged in a quiet cafe away from the media frenzy, was tense but transformative. "I can't undo what I did," Kevin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to be part of the solution. I want to help make sure this never happens to anyone else." Jamal studied Kevin's face, seeing the genuine remorse and desire for redemption. "It won't be easy," he replied, "but if you're willing to put in the work, there's a place for you in this fight." As they talked, the outline of a plan began to form. Kevin would work with civil rights organizations, sharing his insider knowledge to help identify and combat discriminatory practices in other financial institutions. It was a chance at redemption, an opportunity to turn his mistake into a force for positive change. The implementation of the court-mandated changes at Midtown Bank became a closely watched process. The Independent Oversight Committee, composed of civil rights leaders, financial experts, and community representatives, worked tirelessly to overhaul the bank's policies and practices. Tom, whose bravery had been instrumental in exposing the bank's wrongdoings, was offered a position on this committee. His unique perspective as a former insider and whistleblower proved invaluable in identifying and addressing deeply ingrained discriminatory practices. Sarah Mitchell, buoyed by the success of the Midtown Bank case, expanded her investigation to other financial institutions. Armed with the precedent set by the verdict and a growing network of whistleblowers inspired by Tom's example, she began to uncover similar patterns of discrimination across the industry. As the months passed, the impact of the case continued to grow. Other banks, fearing similar lawsuits and public backlash, proactively began to review and revise their policies. Civil rights organizations reported a surge in whistleblowers coming forward from various industries, emboldened by the Midtown Bank verdict. Jamal, now a respected voice in the civil rights movement, traveled the country, speaking at universities, community centers, and corporate boardrooms. His message was clear and consistent. The fight against discrimination required constant vigilance and active participation from all sectors of society. What happened at Midtown Bank wasn't an isolated incident, he would often say. It was a symptom of a larger problem, one that we all have a responsibility to address. Real change doesn't just happen in courtrooms or boardrooms. It happens in our daily interactions, in the choices we make, and in our willingness to stand up for what's right. As the one-year anniversary of the verdict approached, plans were made for a national conference on financial equality. Jamal would be the keynote speaker, addressing an audience that included banking executives, policymakers, and grassroots activists. The night before the conference, Jamal sat in his hotel room, reflecting on the journey of the past year. He thought about the pain and humiliation he had experienced that day at Midtown Bank, and how it had set in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted. He thought about Kevin, Tom, and Sarah, unlikely allies who had played crucial roles in the fight for justice. He thought about the countless individuals who had shared their stories, marched in protests, and demanded change. As he finalized his speech for the conference, Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose. The verdict against Midtown Bank had been a significant victory, but it was just one battle in a much larger war. There was still much work to be done, many minds to be changed, and many systems to be reformed. But as he looked out over the city lights, Jamal felt hope. The movement they had started was growing stronger every day, fueled by the courage of individuals standing up for what was right. Tomorrow, he would take the stage, not just as an individual who had won a lawsuit, but as the voice of a movement that was reshaping the very foundations of equality in America. The story of Midtown Bank was ending, but the story of the fight for true financial equality was just beginning. And Jamal, along with countless others inspired by this victory, was ready to write the next chapter. As dawn broke on the day of the National Conference on Financial Equality, the city buzzed with anticipation. The event had drawn participants from across the country, filling hotels and restaurants with a diverse mix of activists, bankers, politicians, and community leaders. Jamal woke early, his mind already racing with the weight of the speech he was about to deliver. As he dressed, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. The man staring back at him was different from the one who had entered Midtown Bank that fateful day. Older, wiser, and carrying the hopes of many on his shoulders. The conference center was a hive of activity. As Jamal made his way through the crowded halls, he was stopped repeatedly by well-wishers and supporters. He saw familiar faces. Tom, now a respected advocate for corporate accountability. Sarah Mitchell, whose investigations had sparked similar cases across the country. And even Kevin, who had found purpose in educating others about the insidious nature of systemic discrimination. As Jamal took the stage, a hush fell over the packed auditorium. He looked out at the sea of faces, some eager, some skeptical, all attentive. Taking a deep breath, he began his speech. A year ago, we stood on the steps of the courthouse, celebrating a victory that many thought impossible. Today, we gather not to rest on our laurels, but to chart the course for the work that still lies ahead. Jamal's words resonated through the hall, touching on the progress made and the challenges that remained. He spoke of the ripple effects of the Midtown Bank case, how it had inspired other institutions to change their practices, how it had emboldened more individuals to speak out against injustice. But he also warned against complacency. The roots of discrimination run deep, he said, his voice growing passionate. They cannot be eradicated by a single court case or a year of reforms. This is a battle that must be fought every day, in every transaction, in every interaction. As Jamal's speech neared its conclusion, he paused, his gaze sweeping across the audience. I stand before you today not as a victor, but as a reminder that change is possible when we stand together, when we refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. The applause that followed was thunderous, a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. As Jamal left the stage, he was immediately surrounded by a throng of people, all eager to shake his hand, to share their own stories, to pledge their support to the cause. But amidst the chaos, Jamal's attention was drawn to a familiar face, making its way through the crowd. It was Kevin, looking both nervous and determined. As he approached, the crowd parted, sensing the weight of the moment. Jamal, Kevin said, his voice barely audible above the din. I wanted to thank you, not just for giving me a second chance, but for opening my eyes. I never realized how much damage I was doing, how much pain I was causing. I know I can never fully make up for it, but I promise to spend the rest of my life trying." Jamal studied Kevin's face, seeing the genuine remorse and commitment in his eyes. In that moment, he realized that this transformation, this awakening, was perhaps the most profound victory of all. "Kevin," Jamal replied, reaching out to shake his hand, "your journey is a testament to the power of change. It's not about erasing the past, but about creating a better future, and that's something we can all strive for." As the day wore on, the conference became a whirlwind of panels, workshops, and networking sessions. Ideas were shared, alliances were formed, and plans were made for continuing the fight for financial equality. But even as the excitement of the conference reached its peak, Jamal found himself drawn to a quiet corner. There, he encountered an elderly woman, her face lined with years of struggle. "Mr. Jamal," she said, her voice quavering, "I just wanted to say thank you. I've been fighting this fight for longer than you've been alive, and there were times when I thought we'd never see change. But what you've done, it's given us hope. Real hope." Jamal felt a lump form in his throat. He took the woman's hands in his, feeling the weight of history in her touch. "The hope was always there," he said softly. "In you, in everyone who refused to accept injustice. We're just continuing the work you started." As the conference drew to a close, Jamal found himself back on stage, delivering closing remarks. Looking out at the diverse crowd, he felt a surge of emotion. "We leave here today not with a sense of completion, but with a renewed commitment," he said. "The road ahead is long, and there will be obstacles. But we move forward together, united in our belief that a more just and equitable world is not just possible, but necessary." As the final applause faded and people began to file out, Jamal remained on stage, taking in the moment. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from a humiliating experience at a bank to the forefront of a national movement. He thought about Kevin and the complex path of redemption. He thought about Sarah and Tom and the courage it takes to stand up against injustice. He thought about all the unnamed individuals whose stories had fueled this fight. And as he finally left the stage, Jamal realized that while the story of Midtown Bank had come to an end, a new chapter was just beginning. The fight for true equality was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like a battle they could win. The conference center emptied, the participants dispersing to carry the message of change back to their communities. And Jamal, wheeling himself out into the fading light of day, felt a sense of both accomplishment and anticipation. "The work continues," he thought, "and we'll face it together, one day at a time."